So when we talk about improving performance in React apps, most people jump straight to memoization or caching. And while those are important, there's more to performance optimization than just that. React 18 introduced these two new hooks called useTransition and useDeferredValue that help make your app feel smoother and faster. But obviously there's a catch. At the first glance, you'll feel that both of these hooks pretty much do the same thing. And that's where most people get confused. So let me break it down for you. Memoization is a technique to avoid unnecessary re-renders, but what if you need to delay updates altogether? That's where these two hooks come in. But before we jump into these hooks, let's talk about urgent versus non-urgent updates. React treats some updates as high priority, like typing in an input, clicking a button, or animations. These ideally should feel instant. The user should not feel a gap between an action that they do on their keyboard or on their phone and for it to reflect on the screen. There should be no delay between these two actions. On the other hand, things like filtering large lists or data fetching or complex UI calculations, all of these are considered as non-urgent. They can safely happen after the urgent updates in the background. It doesn't really matter because ideally they should not be blocking the main thread. These are not interactive actions. These can happen in the background behind the scenes. useTransition and useDeferredValue are designed to delay these non-urgent updates, but they do it in different ways. useTransition is all about delaying non-urgent state updates while keeping urgent updates like typing or button clicks responsive. It's proactive, so you explicitly mark updates as non-urgent using a start transition method. I'll come to that. Because of it being proactive, this gives us control over what should wait. So we can explicitly mention that this particular state update is not important. It's not of high priority. So we can simply defer it or delay it. So let's take a look at this app. We have a list of 100,000 items and a search box. You'll see that we have this input field, which is essentially a search box. This search box can be used to filter through these items. It's a pretty straightforward app, nothing fancy. If you look at the onChange handler, it's a regular function that is going to first change the state. This is mapped to our input field. So whatever I type in inside this input field, it's going to update it inside this query state. We have this filtered item state as well that is referring to the original set of items. And anytime I type in something inside the input field, you'll see that we are also filtering the list of items. So now if I run this app in my browser, so you see that we have a list of items here, and let me just try to search for item number 30. So now I press I, and I'm not sure if you noticed, but there was a significant delay between me pressing I and it reflecting on the screen. Let me do that again, but this time I'll type in the entire thing. So I'll just go directly to item 30, and I've already typed it. It takes a while to completely update the input state. That's because the list is so huge, and anytime I type in a character, it's re-rendering the entire list. And because of that, it's also blocking the input field. So any update that I try to make on the input field, it's blocked because there is filtering going on, which is also synchronous. And if I try to again look for some other item in the list, you'll see that the input field is not even updating. I've already cleared the input field, but for some reason it's completely stuck. So this is a very bad user experience. Now it updated. So clearly we do not want this for our users. And using useTransition and useDeferredValue, we can actually fix this. So what I'll do is I'll first import the useTransition hook, and this useTransition hook exposes two items. There is an isPending state and the start transition function that I mentioned earlier. I'll use this start transition function to tell React that this particular action or this state update is not of high priority, so you don't need to update it right away. And in this case, we ideally want our input field to update right away, but the filtering can happen a little bit later. It's not a high priority operation. It can happen in the background, but ideally the input field should not be blocked at all. A user should be able to type in anything that they want, and there should be no lag in it. So what I'll do is I'll put the start transition method here, and inside I'll simply move the entire filtering operation. So this now is of high priority, and we have put the filtering operation inside start transition. While this is happening, we also have an option to use this isPending state. So essentially anything that's happening inside the start transition we can use isPending to show like a fallback UI in place of the actual list of items. So that is exactly what we are going to do. I'll use isPending over here, and if isPending is set to true, then I'll simply show a loading message. If that's not the case, then I'll render the list of items. This looks good. Let me save this and go back to the browser. Now if I try to type in inside this input field, you should see that the delay is quite less. There is still some delay. You may not notice it, but I can notice a little bit of lag between me typing in and it reflecting on the screen. But that's because the list in general is so huge that rendering it on the DOM itself is an expensive operation. We have almost 100,000 items on the DOM right now. So to make it more efficient, we can use other strategies like virtualization, but for now we are not going to go into that. But if you compare it with the previous example, it's much more faster. You can see me typing in characters and it updating almost instantly. The input field at least, not the list of items. So that's one way of solving the problem. Now mind you, this start transition method does not make the filtering asynchronous. It only marks it as low priority update. The browser is still stuck running the filter method before React can move on. That's the reason why you still see a little bit of lag when I'm trying to type in even with this implementation. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you can use virtualization to solve that problem, or you can even debug the actual filtering process to prevent excessive re-renders while typing. These enhancements can further help you with the rendering problem. Alright, so now let's look at the second way of handling this, which is with the help of the useDeferredValue hook. Now the first thing that ideally should come to your head is, why do we need two hooks to do the same thing? Well, obviously these two hooks have different purposes, but very difficult to understand on the first go. So let's first look at the hook and then I'll tell you how they are fundamentally different. So I'll make slight changes to the app. First, let's get rid of all the transition related code. So I'll get rid of this line. Let me also remove useTransition. I'll move the filtering operation out of start transition and let's bring this back to our original state. So we are now back to the original example, the unoptimized example. Now let's add the useDeferredValue hook. This hook takes in a mandatory parameter, which is the value that you want to defer. Any update that you want to defer, in this case the input event update, we'll put as part of the first parameter. So for this example, we'll move the query that we have from this use state inside useDeferredValue. Now there's one change that I'll have to make that might not be as straightforward to you, but I'll explain why I'm doing this. Instead of the event handler, the handle search event handler, I directly add the filtered items at the root level and I'll get rid of this event handler altogether. Items.filter can now be moved over here and I don't need the setter. This is going to be deferred query. I don't need handle search anymore. Let me just get the set query from the handle search function. I'll put it inside onChange directly. Let's get rid of this. Let's add E over here. And this looks good. The reason why I did this is because I don't want the filtering to happen right away when I type something. Since this filtering is essentially a synchronous operation, it will also block the UI, which means nothing else will happen until that expensive filtering operation is done. So anytime I try to type in something while this filtering is happening, again we'll get the same experience. It won't let me do anything inside that input field. And I don't want that. So that's the reason why I moved it to the root of the component. When I move this as part of the rendering phase itself, the onChange now only updates the query state. So it's only going to update the actual query state here. React will schedule a re-render because of state update, and then it will run the filtering logic. Since now it happens in the render phase, React will optimize it. So that's the reason why I moved it out of the event handler, because I didn't want it to happen inside the event handler. I wanted it to be part of the rendering phase. I also ideally would want to show some pending state just like we did in the useTransition example. So I'll do one thing here. I'll add a check to see when the query and the deferred query become equal. When that happens, it means that filtering is also done. Because you see that we are filtering on the basis of deferred query. So the moment query and deferred query are equal, that's when the filtering has already happened. So we can use that to show like a pending state, just like we did in the useTransition example. So we don't get one out of the box, but yeah, we can work around it. So I'll just replace this with this piece of code. I am checking if query is not equal to deferred query. If that is the case, we'll show a fallback UI saying filtering. If it is already filtered, then we'll show the actual list. Also, just to make this even better, I will add a use effect so that we are able to see when exactly query and deferred query update. So I'll add this over here. Let me import use effect and let's go back to the browser. Now when I type something inside the input field, you'll see that it updates almost instantaneously. And over here in the console, the query field updates incrementally. So it's updating as and when I add a character, but deferred query doesn't do that. You'll notice that it's still empty string, and only after a while, when React realizes that there's no high priority update left to execute, it will then set it to the actual query value. Again, there's still going to be lag here because the list is so huge. But if you remember the original example, it had blocked the input event for like good 5 to 10 seconds. And this is much better than that. Even though there is some minor lag, I can still see my changes being reflected right away. Again, you can use virtualization or debouncing to make this better, but that's how you would get a somewhat non-blocking, smoother experience with the help of these two hooks. Okay, now that we have covered the use cases behind these two hooks and how they work, let's go back to the question that we had skipped earlier. Why are there two hooks to achieve the same thing? So at first glance, they seem to do the same thing, yes, which is deferring expensive calculations, but the difference lies in how and when they defer updates. React gives you two approaches because sometimes you need explicit control and sometimes you just need a delayed value. You can use useTransition when you want to make some updates low priority while keeping others high priority. You'll use useDeferredValue when you don't need explicit control over the priority, but just want React to decide when to update a value that is derived from some state. With useTransition, you literally control when a state update happens. You have control to make a state update low priority. But with useDeferredValue, you control what part of the state gets delayed. You're not manually making a state update low priority. You're letting React defer expensive calculations, which keeps the UI responsive. So anytime you come across this term called concurrent React, this is what it's about. These two hooks let you prioritize more important events that make the application user-friendly and responsive, while deferring or pushing other not so important events for later. So yeah, this was a short one and I hope it made sense. If you have any other concepts in mind, do put them in the comments and I'll try to make a video around it. If you're new here, do subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.